Hey HOA, this is Mr. Pandan, and today we're going to be looking at causes of the Civil War, specifically the issue of sectionalism, that is the differences and the conflicts between the different regions of the country over the period 1787 to 1833. We've already looked at sort of the development of slavery in colonial America and some of the issues around slavery in the American Revolution and getting into the Constitutional Convention. So this is kind of coming out of the Constitutional Convention and going through the first, roughly speaking, 50 years of the country's existence. So that's kind of what we're at today. So our guiding question for the first section of this unit is going to be, what were the causes of the U.S. Civil War? And when we're looking at causes of the U.S. Civil War, I want you to think deeper than just what were the conflicts between the North and the South. A country can have disagreements. Most countries do. But that doesn't cause civil war. Civil war is a pretty big deal. You could think of it as kind of an analogy, a marriage. In a marriage, you have a couple. Sometimes, things are going great, and sometimes they have arguments. Sometimes they disagree over, where would you like to go out for dinner tonight, or what movie do you want to go see? And there are disagreements, and maybe they have, sort of different personalities, and sometimes those personalities don't exactly gel. But when we're talking about a civil war, I mean, this is divorce. This is the two sides, or at least one of the two sides, deciding that they cannot survive within this relationship with the other party, and they need to dissolve it. So that's a really big deal. And in the case of civil war, it's even bigger than divorce. I mean, this is not, just sort of moving out and taking your property with you. This is going to become people shooting at each other. So this is a big deal. And when you're writing an essay on causes of the Civil War, you need to have that in the back of your mind. It's not enough to just say, oh, they had differences about economic policy, or, they had different views of the Constitution. You have to take that all the way up to the point of, and this is why they were shooting at each other. Why did the South believe that it had to remove itself from the United States? And the flip side of that is, why didn't the North let them? Because you wouldn't have had a civil war if the Southern states had just seceded and the North had said, bye, nice to know you. Don't let the door hit you in the rear on the way out. Civil war is, a much deeper thing. And make sure you do your analysis at that depth and avoid one of the pitfalls that a lot of students get into. Okay, if we go back to the Revolution and look at the relationship between the 13 colonies that are going to become the 13 states, even though they had substantial differences, differences in how the colonies were founded and what the purposes of the colonies were, and kind of how they looked at political issues, their religious differences, their social differences, all that kind of stuff. The bottom line during the Revolution was they had to hang together. They all had grievances against the British. Some of those grievances were the same. Some of them were unique to particular colonies or particular regions. But they all wanted to be free of the British, at least, everybody at the Continental Congress. And the only way they were going to be able to succeed is if they were all in it together. And when you need somebody else to accomplish something, that is kind of the basis of compromise. There's sort of an understanding that you can't have everything your own way, because if you try to have everything your own way, the other guys are going to walk, and then you're all going to have a problem. So compromise is sort of the bottom line of this thing, and the conflicts can never get so severe that they're going to stop cooperating. Now, after the Constitutional Convention, and we already talked about all the compromises that happened between North and South at the Constitutional Convention, some of them to do with slavery and some of them to do with other things like economics and that kind of stuff. But on the slavery issue in particular, slavery had been more or less legal during colonial times in all 13 colonies. Some of them, Massachusetts had sort of started to come out of legal slavery kind of during the Revolution. Slavery had been specifically outlawed in Vermont, which was actually the 14th colony. But those were places where slavery had never been deeply established. And most of the sort of the New England states, the ones that are on this map in sort of light green, they kind of eased out of slavery when they adopted their state constitutions after independence. In the blue states, it was done by law or in some other way. In Pennsylvania, I think it had a lot to do with court decisions. But it was all kind of related to a more gradual emancipation. If slavery had actually gotten established and there was some slavery going on in the colony, and in those blue states, it was mostly in the port areas where slaves were doing work, loading and unloading ships and that kind of stuff. It was more of a gradual emancipation, which meant existing slaves would continue to be slaves for the rest of their lifetime or for some period of years. But as children were born, they were going to get their freedom in some capacity rather than continue to be slaves. So the idea was to kind of not put the burden too much on the property owners, but to still kind of phase slavery out in a gradual way. The other thing you see on this map, that green area, is what they called the Northwest Territories. We refer to it as the Old Northwest to distinguish it from, Washington, Oregon, Idaho. That territory was part of what the United States got at the end of the Revolutionary War in the Treaty of Paris, 1783. And for a variety of reasons, as part of that whole process of compromise, the northern states and Virginia kind of surrendered their various competing claims to that territory, and kind of everything north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi, which is roughly what that territory is, and south of the Great Lakes, becomes the Northwest Territory, and it's eventually going to get carved up into the states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. And that territory, when it gets organized, and this was actually before the Constitutional Convention, when the Confederation Congress was still running things, the agreement was that slavery would not be a thing in that territory. Now, interestingly enough, that law was written pretty much by Confederation Congressman Thomas Jefferson from Virginia. So this idea that there wouldn't be slavery north of the Ohio River was not something that was really imposed on the South. It was a deliberate agreement that had been kind of worked out. The area north of the Ohio River would not have slavery. Remember, what they're trying to do is sell this land to settlers. That's how the government is going to finance itself. And what they knew was the kind of people who were going to be moving in here would be coming from places like Pennsylvania and Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, and they were people who didn't care to have slaves themselves and didn't really want their neighbors having slaves, didn't really want slavery in the neighborhood. And so to make that land marketable, no slavery. And, this is not a place where plantation agriculture is ever going to be a thing because of the climate. And then the flip side of that is south of the Ohio River, slavery is going to expand into the Southwest Territories, which at this point were not really ready to be organized. There were still a lot of Indians down there that needed to be subdued. So the Confederation Congress didn't do a whole lot with the Southwest Territories just yet. But the Northwest Territory, no slavery. Now, as the northern states are abolishing slavery, however they're doing it, don't get the idea that what they're creating is sort of what we would consider equal rights. Far from it. Remember, they're not abolishing slavery because they think that African Americans should have rights and be full participants in society. They're banning slavery because they don't like it as an economic system, and they don't really want all of these African Americans who are freed to be hanging around. They are especially concerned that if other states ban slavery, those former slaves, now free black people, might move into their state and be competition for jobs and whatever. So even though slavery is abolished, the rights of any free blacks that are in the state were restricted, and in particular there were restrictions against additional free black people moving in. Now, some of this was explicit laws that specifically called out and said, you have to be white in order to vote in this state, you have to be white to own property, that kind of thing. But a lot of it was just sort of informal social and economic understandings, which meant if you were a free black fellow and you moved to one of these states, you would find it very difficult to get anyone to sell you property or do business with you or socialize with you. You'd be kind of shunned and that kind of thing. And it would be made very clear to you through informal means that you are really not welcome and you might want to think about going somewhere else. Now, remember too that in early America, race was considered a binary thing. And the binary was you were either black or you weren't. There really wasn't a well-developed concept of white people as a class. So everybody that wasn't black was in the other category. Now, there were, of course, people who were of mixed ancestry. Mixed marriages, in the terms of sort of legal formal arrangements, were either illegal or socially unacceptable. So you didn't see that sort of in the upper classes of respectable society. In the lower classes of not so respectable society, there might be informal arrangements that didn't rise to the level of marriage. People, on the frontier weren't always fussy about, legal recognition of their living arrangements. So there were mixed race children. There were also, cases of sort of people on the plantation kind of doing things at night that they weren't proud of in the daytime. And so you do have mixed race children, but legally speaking, they were black. If they were sufficiently light-skinned and could kind of move to another place and sort of invent themselves a backstory, maybe they could be considered white, but they would have to go through that process of obscuring their origins, and they would have to be, sufficiently of physical attribute that it wouldn't come into question. So generally speaking, this is a very segregated society. Even when there are free black people, they are not having the same kind of equal social and economic opportunities as everybody else. Now, this is very different from what you see in Spanish colonies and French colonies, which had a much more developed sense of rights for mixed race children. And they had a whole hierarchy. Depending on how white you were, the more white you were, the higher you were on the social ladder. But even if you were only a little bit white, you were of a higher class than somebody who wasn't white at all. Still not exactly what we would call equal rights, but a different way of looking at things. In America, it's pretty much an either-or situation, or at least in what's going to become the United States of America. Now, If we look at the sort of history of the founding fathers, we kind of and look at it through the lens of where are they on the slavery issue. It's kind of interesting. Thomas Jefferson, slave owner, he had a large property, Monticello. You're probably familiar with it, in near Charlottesville, and it's a large plantation. There's a lot of slaves doing the labor. I mean, Thomas Jefferson does not roll up his sleeves and pick the tobacco or do any of the other work. He has people who do that for him. And he inherited this whole operation from his father. It's not like, he went out and created this thing. If you asked him, and certainly in his earlier writings, he's very critical of slavery. He doesn't like it. Now, he's not so upset with it that he's going to, divest himself of his livelihood and, become a pauper. But he doesn't like slavery. He wished there wasn't such a thing. Yeah, nice wishes. There's also the whole Sally Hemings thing, which you're probably familiar with. Sally Hemings was a slave at Monticello. She was believed to be the mother of some of Jefferson's children, children who, of course, would have been slaves. There was a lot of DNA research done about 10 or 15 years ago. It's a little inconclusive because Thomas Jefferson doesn't have any male white descendants to compare it to. So the only thing we can say for sure is that some of Sally Hemings' children were related to Thomas Jefferson's father. Now, does that mean by virtue of coming down through Jefferson, or there's also a theory that it was Jefferson's nephews who spent a lot of time at Monticello in the relevant time period? Nobody really knows, and we'll never be able to get completely to the bottom of that. But regardless, it doesn't really matter. The point is Jefferson owned slaves that were his blood relatives, and he didn't do anything about it, which, is a commentary on Thomas Jefferson. Even though he criticized slavery in his earlier writings, most notably the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, in politics, Jefferson was not taking an abolitionist position. His sort of political position, as he's building the Democratic Republican Party and in his competition with Alexander Hamilton, he needs the support of Southerners. And if you want the support of Southerners, you don't mess with slavery. And of course, at the end of the day, Jefferson never freed his slaves. As he got older, to be perfectly frank, he couldn't because he was so deep in debt that his creditors were not about to let him divest himself of property before he died. And when he died, his creditors seized Monticello and all the property, including the human property, and disposed of it accordingly. So, if you want to say Thomas Jefferson is a hypocrite because of all the, rights of man, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness thing, you won't get an argument from me. Now, Benjamin Franklin is not a guy that we think of as being associated with slavery, but Benjamin Franklin, Pennsylvania, he did own slaves on and off between 1735 and 1781. Now, Benjamin Franklin doesn't own a plantation, so he doesn't have a lot of slaves, but he did have sort of household servants, people who worked at the print shop, that kind of thing. Benjamin Franklin lived a long time. He was most of 90 when he died. And over the course of his lifetime, if you look at his writings and his letters that he wrote to people, it's clear that his views on race evolved. As a young man, he sort of took the view that was common in that era, which was black people are inferior, they're not as smart as white people, they're not as capable, blah, blah, blah. But as time went on and he had more experience, Franklin is a scientist, and he's a guy that prides himself on observation and adjusting his views according to what he actually sees. And as he has more experience of observing African Americans, he comes to the conclusion over time that the real disparity between black and white is not genetic, it's opportunity, and it's things like lack of education and that kind of thing. So in the later period of his life, he becomes an outspoken abolitionist, but only after the conclusion of the Constitutional Convention. Remember, he's in the room in Philadelphia when they're making all those compromises, and he's agreeing to them. The 3/5 compromise, all of that other stuff. Franklin believes that the unity of the country is more important than pursuing the slave issue. So he doesn't pursue the slave issue until the Constitution is written and ratified and in place, and then he becomes an abolitionist. So judge him according to that. Alexander Hamilton, who's become famous on Broadway in recent years, he's also got some connections to slavery. He was born on the island of Nevis in the Caribbean, which was a slave colony. Lots of slaves working on the sugar plantations. As a young man, he had a job with a trading company that traded, in addition to other things, slaves. As far as we know, probably Alexander Hamilton never owned a slave. Now, there's some question about that. There's some transactions that he bought slaves on behalf of other people, and so, technically he may have had ownership of them until he was reimbursed for the cost. Take that for what you will. He did speak out against slavery, but he was careful not to speak out very loudly. Remember, he's also got political ambitions, and he understands that if you want to get anywhere in the United States, you can't be hated by Southerners. So while he may not have been a slave owner, he certainly was not an outspoken abolitionist. And then, of course, there's George Washington, the most famous resident of Fairfax County ever, and clearly he owned slaves. He was one of the largest landowners in Virginia and had one of the largest plantations. The folks at Mount Vernon have done a really good job of documenting not just Washington's views on slavery, but what it was like, what slavery was like in practice on Mount Vernon. And we probably know more about the functioning of slavery at Mount Vernon than we do about any place else, because there were so many people who visited Washington there. People from the north as well as the south, and it's a big deal to go to Mount Vernon and see George Washington. So the first thing they do when they're done is write a letter to all their friends and say, "Ooh, I went to Mount Vernon and met George Washington. Here's what I saw and here's what it's like." And Northerners in particular had a kind of fascination with slavery. So there's a lot of descriptions in those letters about what was going on at Mount Vernon. And it's a treasure trove of data for historians. What we do know about Washington is, like with Franklin, his views evolved over time. As a young man, he was sort of, in the whole kind of white supremacy that everybody else was in. As he had more and more experiences through the Revolution and into, the early years of the government, he clearly came to the realization that African Americans were people, intelligent people, had abilities, and all that kind of stuff. And the more that he thought about that, the less comfortable he was with the idea of slavery. But Washington's also a very practical man. He knows that there's more, freeing slaves is harder than just, hey, you're free, off you go. Don't let the door hit you in the rear on the way out. It's more complicated than that. You can't just free slaves. You have to make some provision for them to be able to support themselves. And so Washington really struggled with that. Now, what he did do that's pretty well documented is, unlike a lot of slave owners, Washington was very reluctant to sell slaves without their consent. He had he had a clear understanding that it was, you know, you sell the father, one place and the mother another place and the children another place, you destroy people's families, and they're very upset about that. And Washington didn't really want to do that. As a result, he ended up with a lot more slaves at Mount Vernon than he really needed to run the place, especially as he got out of the tobacco business and into things that were more profitable. And I think it's also a factor with Washington that he doesn't have children of his own. So as he's writing his will, he's got a lot of considerations in his mind. He's thinking a lot about his historical reputation, and he's thinking a lot about his moral duties and that kind of thing. And he makes provision in his will to free all of the slaves that he owns. Now, that's not all the slaves at Mount Vernon. Very complicated property arrangements. Some of those slaves technically belong to Martha, and even the ones that technically belonged to Martha, she didn't really own. She only had the use of them. She had inherited them from her first husband when he died, and when she died, they had to be handed off to the Custis family, to the other heirs. But legally, Washington was able to free the slaves that he owned, and he did so and provided them with land to settle. And if you're familiar with the Gum Springs neighborhood, which is over on Route 1, kind of between West Potomac and Mount Vernon High School, that's where a lot of those people settled, on land that George Washington provided. And it's still to this day an African-American neighborhood. And some of those people can trace their lineage all the way back to Mount Vernon. So my point in going over this is when you look at the Founding Fathers, it's not an easy thing to judge them in terms of their views of slavery. It's a very complicated issue. These are real people living in difficult times, in most cases in a situation that they didn't create, and only had a limited amount of power to do anything about. And that is sort of true more broadly about the country as a whole. Abolishing slavery once it got started was a very complex thing. And when faced with complex things, most people try to avoid them. And that's pretty much what happened in the US. Now, there's a couple of important events going on in the early history of the United States that are impacting sort of attitudes towards slavery. And the first of those I want to look at is the Haitian Revolution. We know that the French Revolution starts in 1789, and you have, the Tennis Court Oath and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the storming of the Bastille and all of that. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. And word of this sort of makes its way out to the far reaches of the French Empire, including the island of Saint-Domingue, which, the old name for what's now Haiti. And funny thing, the slaves on the island of Haiti said, great, rights of man, liberty, égalité, fraternity. We want us some of that. And the French said, oh, no, not for you. That's only for white people. And they weren't really interested in that response. And they launched the first successful slave revolt in the Americas. Haiti was basically a sugar colony, which meant there were an awful lot of slaves and not very many slave owners or slave managers. And that, in part, was one reason for the success of the Haitian Revolution. Now, it wasn't a pretty sight. When the slaves finally took over, there were pretty much massacres of white people who didn't get away. The ones that did get away got away with some really harrowing stories about, how this thing had gone, and, they're penniless refugees who have lurid stories of how their families were, killed in incredibly unpleasant ways. And where do these people end up? They end up in many cases in New Orleans and Charleston, South Carolina, and in other places in the United States. And they tell these stories. And, that experience, that fear is going to take root among U.S. slave owners, and they're going to have a very negative attitude toward abolition. It's not just an economic thing. It's not just the loss of property, because even people in the South who didn't own slaves were very leery about abolition because they were afraid that, if the slaves got their freedom, if you took your boot off of their neck, they would revolt in a very violent way, and they wouldn't be very fussy about, whether it was white people who owned slaves or white people who didn't own slaves. When the massacre comes, it's it's a free-for-all. And so that's part of the reason that slave owners are going to be very, very, very wary of any kind of abolition. It's not just a money thing. But on the side of the money thing, the next big event, the invention of the cotton gin. I don't want to go into a huge amount of detail on this, but suffice it to say there are two kinds of cotton. Long staple and short staple, and the difference is basically how tightly the seeds are enmeshed into the cotton fibers. If you've ever seen a cotton plant, it's like a little flower, and there's a puppy little ball of cotton, which is essentially the flower, and in there are seeds. And the kind of cotton that grows in most of the southern United States is long staple cotton, where the seeds are very tightly wound into the fibers. And prior to 1793, there wasn't really a good way to separate the seeds from the fibers, so cotton really wasn't going to be a practical crop. And then Eli Whitney comes along with his invention, and what it does is separates the fibers from the seeds very easily. And that makes cotton practical as a commercially viable product. Now remember, this is 1793. Remember all that stuff you learned freshman year about the early industrial revolution in England. It's all about textiles. It's all about making cloth. So they've got their spinning jennies and their power looms and all that kind of thing. The English have created all this early industry, and it's all about turning cotton and other fibers into cloth. Cotton doesn't grow in England. They need a supply, and the supply is going to be the southern United States. And over the course of the next few decades, cotton is going to become the #1 export from the United States. In order to do this, you have to have slaves. The cotton gin is a nice machine for separating the seeds from the fiber, but the picking of the cotton, the planting of the cotton, the weeding of the cotton, all of that is still, hand labor. And you need somebody to do that. And the somebody who's going to do that is slaves. And that means slaves are going to increase in value because of, higher demand and limited supply. And the location, the geography of slavery is going to shift away from the coastal areas and into the heart of cotton country. Another factor related to this is going to be the Louisiana Purchase. In 1803, having given up on his attempts to retake Haiti, Napoleon, at that point Emperor of France, pretty much gives up on the idea of rebuilding the French Empire in the Western Hemisphere. He decides that what he really needs to do is invade Russia, and to do that, he's going to need some cash. And so what better way to get that cash than to sell the Louisiana Territory, which is basically everything west of the Mississippi River that drains into the Mississippi River. He's going to sell that to the United States. And Thomas Jefferson, who at that point is president, is going to be very happy to purchase it, because not so much because of the territory, mostly his immediate concern is undisputed control of the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans. Remember, everything east of the Mississippi and west of the Appalachian Mountains, all of the streams and rivers drain into the Mississippi, and so the natural transportation route from places like Ohio and Kentucky and Indiana is down to New Orleans. And the United States needs to control New Orleans if it's going to be able to have viable economic development of these territories. And of course, the Louisiana Purchase itself is going to become a big deal eventually, but not right away, because even though Napoleon sold it, the Indians who actually lived there didn't sell it, and it's going to take a while to deal with them. But this is going to create a new place for slavery to expand to. The southern reaches of the Louisiana Purchase are prime cotton land, and those are going to develop pretty quickly. But another thing that's going to come with that is, remember, New Orleans used to be one of those Catholic colonies owned at various times by the French and the Spanish. New Orleans is already an established community. And in that established community, there is a place for what they call free persons of color in various shades of color. And that's all kind of something that exists under French law that the United States is going to have to deal with. And that community of free persons of color is going to continue to exist in New Orleans. They're going to have rights that are going to be gradually defined in various ways. It's going to be a little bit of a tough thing for the U.S. to swallow, and it's going to take a while. And when we get up to the Civil War, we're going to come back to that, because Louisiana is going to be kind of a special place and not exactly the same as, say, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. And that's going to have ramifications when we get into the Civil War and the period immediately after. And then concurrent with all of this is the end of the Atlantic slave trade, or at least the end of the Atlantic slave trade to the United States. There's going to continue to be an Atlantic slave trade to areas in Central and South America. Brazil isn't going to abolish slavery until, I think, the 1870s. And there's going to be trade to Brazil, at least what can get past British patrols. The British had kind of decided that the Atlantic slave trade was a bad thing. As one of those constitutional compromises, Congress had been given the power to ban the importation of slaves after 1808, which was basically 20 years after the adoption of the Constitution. And Congress did that without too much trouble. And you ask yourself, well, why did the Southerners agree to this in Congress? Well, they agreed to it in part because of that whole supply and demand thing. If you're no longer bringing in new slaves from Africa, the existing slaves who are already in the United States are going to increase in value. In the old tobacco areas, Virginia, Maryland, into North Carolina, and parts of Kentucky, slavery had gotten less economical when tobacco had gotten less economical. And so a lot of those places had a surplus of slaves. Slaves have children, and the children have children, and so there's a natural increase going on. And in many of those cases, particularly in Virginia, there are plantations who are making most of their revenue not from the crops they grow, but from the slaves that they sell. There's an oversupply of slaves in the upper South, the old tobacco areas, and there's a excess demand for slaves in the cotton regions that are being developed. And so you're going to see a mass migration from the upper South to the lower South, an involuntary migration. We'd look at it as the second involuntary migration. There's the first one where people are brought against their will from Africa, and now people are being taken against their will from the upper South to the deep South. And that's going to change the geography of slavery. And as part of that, Alexandria, our hometown, ends up hosting the largest slave market in North America. A lot of the slaves that are being sold out of Maryland, Virginia, and this area are going to be processed through the Alexandria slave market, which you see there. It's on it's like 1317 Duke Street, about less than 2 miles from Edison High School. This picture is from during the Civil War, which is why there are Union soldiers out front, and it is no longer currently operating as a slave market. But when it was operating in a very big way. So, this is not, we're not talking about something that happened in a place, far, far away. It's a time far, far away, but it's right here where we live. Okay, I like this map because it shows the spread of slavery over time, and it's just basically illustrating what we were already talking about. If you look in the early years of the country, slavery is pretty much concentrated in the tobacco area, which is here around the Chesapeake Bay, and then also in South Carolina, where the crop is not tobacco, it's things like rice and indigo. Then once cotton takes off, you see slavery kind of spreading into this area, which is pretty much where we're going to see cotton production. And that's really going to start to explode as you get into 1830, 1840, and 1850. So this movement of slaves from the upper South, sort of the northeastern part of the South, to the more southern reaches of the South, is going to affect a lot of attitudes. When we're talking about Southern support for slavery, it's going to be much bigger in the cotton areas. And you're also going to see here in the mountain areas, very little slavery. And so this is going to be a place where there's not a huge amount of support for slavery. And there's going to be another region over here, which is similar. And that's going to affect, in a lot of ways, the progress of the Civil War. So that map is something that we're probably going to want to come back to as we get further along. Now, in about 1820, give or take, you're going to start to see a broad religious revival movement in the United States. It's been called the Second Great Awakening to distinguish it from the First Great Awakening, which happened back in like the 1730s, 1740s. These things seem to, happen roughly every 100 years or so. Big movements for religious revival and social change. And one element of this is going to be a desire to abolish slavery. Now, in 1820, this is starting out very, very small, and a lot of it is inspired by what was going on in England. In England, in part perhaps because they no longer have as many slave colonies as they did before. England had gotten very big on the idea of abolitionism, and you probably remember that from freshman year, William Wilberforce and his movement. And that spreads to the United States in some areas. It's mostly a religious movement, mostly very small. Abolitionists were considered very radical and probably dangerous radicals. They were endangering the unity of the country and stirring up a lot of trouble. Even people who weren't particularly fond of slavery were not particularly interested in an active movement to abolish it. They were just happy that it was somewhere else and they didn't have to think about it. Abolitionists were kind of in people's face about this issue, and when you get into people's face about something that they don't want to have to think about, you're not going to be very politically popular. Over time, the popularity of abolitionism is going to rise, but it's going to be a very slow thing from the beginning. What's more of a thing in the early years of the country is sectionalism. Remember what we said at the beginning of this thing. These different areas of the country were willing to compromise when they had to compromise to survive. When it was necessary to work together to defeat the British in the Revolution, there was a tendency to compromise. At the Constitutional Convention, they couldn't get a document unless they compromised, so there was compromise. Even in the early years of the operation of the country, when the parties began to form, Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party and Hamilton's Federalist Party, no national party could succeed without having appeal in both regions. I mean, the whole US political system is designed, you have to create a majority. And you don't get a majority if you don't only appeal to half of the country. Now, the calculus is going to start to change with westward expansion. As you get new states in the West, there's a real competition between the parties who's going to be able to get the support of those Western states. And the guy who succeeds in that effort is Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party was oriented around, the idea of the country as an agricultural country, the idea that farmers were superior citizens to the kind of people who engage in commerce and trade. And he was able to sell that idea and created what was called at times the Virginia Dynasty. The Virginia Dynasty refers to the fact that from 1800, you have Jefferson, 2 terms as president, James Madison, 2 terms as president, James Monroe, 2 terms as president. So that's 24 years of presidents from Virginia leading the Democratic Republican Party. And by the time you get to the end of that process, 1824, the Democratic Republican Party is pretty much the only party around. The Federalists have sort of dried up and declined into a small regional party that can, elect governors in New England and maybe some Congress, but there's no way they can control Congress. But the flip side of that is as you expand the base of your party to make it a true permanent majority, it's not going to be just Virginia anymore. Virginia is not going to be able to control this thing. Eventually, there's going to be pressure to have some of the leadership from outside of Virginia. And that's what we're going to start to see when we get around to 1824. But before that happens, we've got the issue of the Missouri Compromise. Now, the issue in the Missouri Compromise is pretty much at this point the Southwest, that area you see on this map as this area, has pretty much been populated, thanks in part to the cotton boom, and states have been created. The question in 1820 was the admission to the United States of the state of Missouri. Now, Missouri was a little bit tricky. There was slavery in Missouri, not a lot, a little bit, mostly along in St. Louis, in areas involved in sort of river traffic and commerce. But this is outside of the cotton zone. Cotton doesn't really grow in Missouri. And everything was sort of, clicking along nicely for the admission of Missouri. And then somebody threw into the mix, hey, we've already kind of established the Ohio River as the dividing line between slave and free. And the Ohio River sort of meets the Mississippi right about there. So the idea was, why don't we just sort of continue that line and make it a sort of line of latitude and continue the separation between slave and free. And that caused a huge amount of consternation in Congress because it made slavery an issue. Nobody had really done a lot of direct talking about slavery, but now it's sort of on the table. And a lot of Northern politicians feel the need to oppose this now that it's a slavery issue, and a lot of Southern politicians say, "Well, we have to, hang on to this." And Congress kind of deadlocks for a while, and then they reach a compromise. The compromise is Missouri will become a slave state. To balance that out, the state of Maine, which had recently separated from Massachusetts and become a state on its own, or applied for statehood on its own, Maine would also be admitted. So, slave-free balance, yay. And then what to do about the rest of the Louisiana Territory, we'll go ahead and draw that line. No slavery north of that line, slavery is okay south of that line. The interesting thing is that line just happens to roughly correspond with the northern limits of cotton production. And so everybody kind of figured, well, you're not going to need slavery up there anyway, because you can't grow cotton up there. And everybody sort of patted themselves on the back and shook each other's hands and went down to the local tavern for some refreshment and said, we have dealt with this problem. Okay, we'll see how that holds up. The other thing that's going on in this period is something that we call the American system, or at least that's what Henry Clay called it. And you see Henry Clay here in the picture, which is actually a photograph. Photography has been invented. The American system has a couple of elements. There's a protective tariff, and you may remember a protective tariff is a tax on imported goods to make their price higher than domestically produced goods, and that protects domestic industry. Second element of the American system, a national bank. The idea of a national bank was to provide a place for credit. Money could be loaned in the United States. You wouldn't have to go to foreigners, and that would be a good thing for promoting trade. And then since both of those things tend to generate money, what are you going to do with that money? The idea was federal subsidies for roads and canals, what they called internal improvements, what we call infrastructure. And what Henry Clay has got in mind here is actually kind of brilliant. Although I can't give him all the credit because, as you may have noticed, hiding there in the background is Alexander Hamilton. Most of this goes back to Hamilton's economic plan from the very earliest years of the country. Now, the interesting thing is, Democratic Republicans rejected all this because it was Hamilton's idea, and they wanted no part of it. But now the Federalists are pretty much out of the picture. They are not a political force anymore, and Democratic Republicans like Henry Clay are saying, that guy Hamilton had some really good ideas. Maybe we can steal them now. And so here you go. Henry Clay is from Kentucky, and Kentucky is, in those days, a Western state. And Henry Clay wants to see the country united. And in particular, he's trying to unite Western and Northern interests. And there's a lot here for the North, industry and commerce, and for the West, who needed infrastructure, internal improvements, roads and canals. And it's really a way for these sort of, I don't know, what do we want to call them, maybe neo-federalists. They don't identify as federalists, no. They are good Democratic Republicans, but trying to preserve national unity by coming up with this plan, which, it's kind of Hamilton's plan. Now, Southerners didn't have a whole lot here. There's not a lot for them. Remember, their business, by and large, is cotton. Cotton protective tariff doesn't help you sell your cotton. Cotton is an export. All it does is make your purchases of manufactured goods more expensive. They don't really need the national bank. The cotton is selling for a pretty good price, and they can kind of finance their operations without too much trouble. And they don't really need infrastructure. Cotton grows in floodplains along rivers, so the rivers provide the transportation. You don't need to build roads. You don't need to build canals. So the South is looking at this and saying, what's in this for us? And the answer is not very much. And politically, this is kind of reducing the traditional political power of the South as kind of the linchpin of political power. And that is something that is going to create some objections. Now, another guy that's going to be important in this mix is Andrew Jackson. Gee, I wish I had 3 hours to talk about Andrew Jackson. This is a really fascinating guy. He came to fame as the defender of New Orleans. He was the commander of the American force in the War of 1812 that was sent to defend New Orleans from a British invasion. They were outmanned, outgunned, and Andrew Jackson sort of cobbled together out of the residents of New Orleans, who, remember, weren't all that attached to the United States yet. Some frontiersmen who came down from Tennessee and points north, pirates like Jean Lafitte. He cobbled that all together into a successful defense that repulsed the British and really saved Louisiana as part of the United States. The British had never really accepted the Louisiana Purchase. They didn't think Napoleon had the right to sell it. And had they gotten control of New Orleans, who knows what might have happened. It didn't, and Andrew Jackson gets most of the credit for that. As an encore, he went on to conquer Florida. The United States paid the Spanish, but Jackson had already pretty much taken possession of the place. And all of these sort of military victories made Jackson kind of a hero of both the South and the West. He was a man of the South and the West. He'd been born in North Carolina, but as a young man had gone over the mountain, settled in Tennessee, and in that sort of rough and tumble frontier environment, had kind of risen to the top of the pile. He got into politics and was campaigning against the American system. He didn't think that it was constitutional. He didn't think it was good for the country as a whole. He thought it only benefited moneyed interests in the East. And this is going to split the Democratic-Republican Party, because you have sort of what come to be called the National Republicans, led by Clay, who are for the American system, and you've got the Democratic Republicans, led by Jackson, who don't want it. And eventually, these are going to split, and Jackson's faction is going to become the modern Democratic Party. I say modern, but there's still a lot to go. Clay's faction is going to eventually become the Whig Party. Now, Jackson's going to be a candidate for president in 1824. He's going to get the most votes, but as we all know, getting the most votes isn't what counts. Getting the electoral votes is what counts. Jackson actually had more electoral votes than anybody else. It was a four-way race, but surprise, surprise, when you don't have a majority of the electoral votes, the election goes to Congress. And who do you suppose had a lot to say in the House of Representatives when they made their selection? Speaker of the House, Henry Clay. And the election was thrown to John Quincy Adams. And lo and behold, John Quincy Adams chooses as his Secretary of State and number 2 man, Henry Clay. Jackson is furious. He makes a lot of very explosive statements. and decides that he's going to be back in 4 years. He is back in 4 years. That time it's not a four-way race, it's a two-way race. Jackson versus Adams, and Jackson wins handily. Um, Jackson has a lot in common with Donald Trump, in the sense that he's an outsider who kind of takes over a political faction and upends a lot of the sort of traditional things that had been going on and brings a lot of radical change. You can argue about whether the change was good or whether it was bad, but the point is you've got an outsider coming in and shaking up the system, and that's definitely what Andrew Jackson is trying to do. Now, during the campaign in 1828, the tariff issue became a very big deal. Remember, Jackson is opposed to the tariff. Adams is in favor of the tariff. It's part of the American system. During the summer of 1828, right in the middle of the campaign, there is a huge increase in tariffs. It's probably extremely ill-advised because that's one of the reasons that President John Quincy Adams loses the election. Now that once Jackson is sworn in, and you can see how well he did and where he did well. Jackson did well in the West and the South, and the only place that he didn't was kind of New England. Jackson lowered the tariff. He, also had a majority in Congress. They lowered the tariff, but they didn't lower it all the way to where it was before. And that becomes the sticking point. Vice President John C. Calhoun was outraged. Now, remember, this is a period of time when presidents did not really choose their vice president, and particularly because the situation in the Democratic-Republican Party had been very unsettled through 1824 and 1828. Calhoun was not Jackson's man. Calhoun was the party's man. The presidential election had been a four-way split. Calhoun was the only Democratic-Republican running for vice president, and so he was successful. But he didn't really feel like he owed Jackson a lot of favors. And Calhoun he was even more anti-tariff than Jackson. The tariff was particularly disliked in South Carolina for a lot of reasons, and that's where Calhoun is from. So Calhoun persuades the South Carolina legislature to pass what they called an ordinance of nullification, and it eventually gets voted on by the citizens of South Carolina and becomes law. And what they said down in South Carolina was the tariff is unconstitutional. And because it is unconstitutional, it is not valid and cannot be enforced within the state of South Carolina. This idea of nullification wasn't a brand new idea. Jefferson and Madison had kind of played around with this idea back during the first Adams administration on something called the Alien and Sedition Acts. Look that up if you're interested. So it's an idea that had been sort of hanging out there, that the idea of what do you do when Congress passes an unconstitutional law was still not entirely nailed down at this point in American history. And the states are trying to kind of claim the right to do that, or at least South Carolina in this case. Now, both sides have arguments. Calhoun's argument in favor of nullification, he says the federal taxing power is for raising money. It's not for, supporting industry. It's not for building commerce. It's not for any of that. If you don't need the money, don't raise the money. And the idea is it should be, done fairly in a way that, doesn't benefit one part of the country over another. As a constitutional argument, I think that's fairly weak, but there you go. The second point I think is more solid, which is an unconstitutional federal law Congress has no power to pass a law beyond its, what the Constitution authorizes. And if they do, it's not binding on the state. And that would certainly be the case, if the Supreme Court declares a law unconstitutional, it doesn't get enforced and nobody has to follow it. On Jackson's side, against nullification, they're saying, look, setting tariffs is an enumerated federal power. It's right there in Article 1, Section 8. You can pass a tariff, and Congress has the power to decide what the tariff should be, and they can make it whatever they want. That's a fairly well-established thing. So I think, yeah, definitely on the constitutional argument, you got to give kind of points to Jackson. And the other point that Jackson makes is pretty clear. The Constitution says federal laws are supreme over state laws. I mean, it's right there in it's Article 6, the Supremacy Clause. It says it right there. Federal laws passed according to the Constitution are supreme over state laws. States can't do anything about it. So, I mean, that's the argument. Now, how does it get solved? Congress, which is controlled by Jackson's party, passes what they call the Force Bill. And the Force Bill authorizes President Jackson to use military force to collect the tariff. Military force, they're talking about sending the army down to South Carolina. Now, Andrew Jackson, remember, he is a military man, and he has got a reputation for being a no-nonsense fellow. And when he says, use military force to collect the tariff, what he's talking about is, going down to South Carolina at the head of an army, arresting anybody that gets in his way and hanging them from the nearest tree. The Force Bill is, forceful, to say the least. But at the same time that Congress passes the Force Bill, they're also passing an additional tariff reduction. So this is, kind of the carrot and the stick. Jackson is saying, okay, you got a point on the tariff. We'll knock it down a little more. But, if you better be satisfied with that because we're not fooling around here when it comes to federal supremacy. Jackson is, a military man, but he's also a pretty good politician. And South Carolina, having considered the possibility of having Andrew Jackson come down and string them up from the nearest tree, repeals their ordinance of nullification. But in repealing the ordinance of nullification, they do not renounce the power of nullification. In fact, like 3 days after they repealed the ordinance of nullification, they said, we're only repealing this particular nullification. We still have the right to nullify future federal laws that we deem unconstitutional. Okay, Jackson, isn't going to argue the point because, he's kind of won on the central issue. The tariff is going to be collected. Now, the significance of this is pretty clear. You've got a crisis between at least some elements in the South, and it was really South Carolina. The rest of the South, there were some people who thought South Carolina was on the right track. There were some people who thought South Carolina was being insane. So I don't know that this was broadly supported by the South in general, but it is kind of a sectional dispute. It's resolved by a political compromise, and a political compromise was possible because nobody really wanted this thing to go, over the edge. Nobody wants to fight the Civil War in 1832. But there are some important precedents that are hanging along from this. South Carolina is claiming and continuing to claim the right to interpret the Constitution on its own, and that's going to continue to be a thing going forward. The federal government has also established the precedent here that if a state is rebellious and does not want to kneel to federal authority, the federal government can use military force to bring it into line. And that obviously is a precedent that's going to be taken back up when we get to 1861. Now, in this case, most of the South is ends up being behind Jackson, and Calhoun finds himself out on a limb. Um, but that's partly because they trusted Jackson. Jackson's a Southerner, and this is an issue. The tariff is an issue that lends itself to compromise. It's a tax. You can split the difference. You can lower it a little bit. Um, that's the kind of thing that's easy to compromise. But when we get into more fundamental issues, and particularly issues of a binary nature, like will we have slavery or not, um, it's hard to split the difference on that. That's an either or. And what's going to happen if we don't have a Southern president, but we have a Northern president who was elected by Northerners? And doesn't appear to have any interest in the interests of the South. What will happen? What will happen? Stay tuned and we will find out.